Number one is decomplexification. I'll think of a better name. I'm just taking a physicist's perspective of acceleration in projects. So it's really looking at it purely from hard science and mathematics.
When you talk about complexity, are you talking about the scope of the project, how the schedule is built?
Complexity isn't a more complex word for example, difficulty of scope or ambiguity of information or volume of work. Complexity is actually a measurable thing in nature, and it's got its own set of equations. And essentially, complexity is the interconnectedness of things. In physics, is that when, for a given system, when the complexity or the interconnectedness number gets to a certain level, the system starts behaving differently than when it was smaller.
What you just said to me was just go delete more relationship ties. Go into P6 and just start hacking away. Does that actually solve the problem of complexity, or do you need to do something that is actually more fundamentally changing to the project?
Complexity works on the network, not on the node. So, for example, if I had two projects, both of them had the same number of tasks and the same uncertainty, but one was more complex or more interconnected than the other. If you run a Monte Carlo simulation, the one that's more complex would be worse. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. It's if you have less stuff that can go wrong, you should finish earlier than if you have more stuff that could go wrong.
Yeah.
Like, it's people know this. It's the same in sports where you're like, just get the basics right. Don't try and excel at the complex skills. Just get the basics really, really right and do them repeatable all the time. It's that kind of principle.
Hi, folks. A quick one before we dive into this week's episode. Our book, The Critical Path Career, How to Advance in Construction and Planning and Scheduling, is out now, and you can order it on Amazon. We'll include a link below. This is a great way to show support for the Beyond Deadlines podcast, and Greg and I have worked extremely hard taking everything we know in our 30 years of experience, plus everything we've picked up from shooting this podcast, and we've tried to pack it into an information-dense book that you can use right away. In the book, we have specific strategies on how to get a raise, how to get a promotion, and find a new job. We include 26 of the best interview questions that we have come across, in addition to 34 specific impact ideas that you can go use on your projects today. We want to thank everyone who's shown us support so far and enjoy this week's episode. Welcome to the Beyond Deadlines podcast, where we tackle challenges that planning and schedule leaders come across on a day-to-day basis. My name is Micah Piippo, and I'm a planning and scheduling manager for Intel.
And my name is Greg Lawton. I'm the CEO of an AI schedule management company called Nodes and Links.
Each episode is designed to give you tactics that you can use on a day-to-day basis. Today, we're going to dive right into complexity. Greg, are you ready?
Let's go.
All right, Greg, you've been talking about a book that you are writing on acceleration. We previously wrote The Critical Path Career, where we took over how to manage your career, how to get raises, promotions, and new jobs. We're switching the gears a little bit, and we're moving into how to accelerate projects. And you have been rooming around and dancing around on 3 to 4 really interesting topics, and let's dive into them. So what's number one?
Number one is decomplexification. I'll think of a better name, but it's actually, by the way, these are, so the book that I'm writing is, I'm just taking a physicist's perspective of acceleration in projects. So it's really looking at it purely from hard science and mathematics, and trying to understand how you actually accelerate projects mathematically, as opposed to, let's say, how you accelerate projects from a soft standpoint, like motivate people or these kinds of things. And it's really more just a labor of love because one, I'm a physicist, two, I'm interested, and three, I love projects. So I'm looking at projects as a physicist. But what's really, really cool is I've stumbled across so many things from physics that actually relate to projects that I've never heard anybody talk about before, which is why I don't know the words to use it. I can only use the words in physics, and I haven't thought of them for projects yet. But the first one is around complexity in projects. So I just think that's a super interesting thing that we can talk about.
Yeah. Well, complexity in projects is interesting because we work on complex projects. So,
Mm-hmm.
most people who are planners and schedulers get hired into either I would say, $400 million, $300 million up to, billions of dollars type of range. And
Mm-hmm.
when you get into that, those are complex projects. So they probably create complex schedules and complex scheduling processes. When you talk about complexity, are you talking about the scope of the project, how the schedule is built? How does this tie back into?
So that's a beautiful question. So here's the thing. Again, I'm gonna ignore that I do projects now, and I'm gonna just talk like I'm a physicist. Complexity isn't a more complex word for example, difficulty of scope or ambiguity of information or volume of work. Complexity is actually a measurable thing in nature, and it's got its own set of equations. And essentially, complexity is the interconnectedness of things. So, for example, if I wanted to measure the complexity of a network, so let's say you have three people, and those three people could talk to each other with one way. So, as in verbally, then person one talks to person two to person three to person one. You've only got three methods of communication. So the complexity of that is low compared to, for example, if you have five people, then it grows significantly. So you've got one to two, two to three, three to four, four to five, five to one to three, one to four, two to four, two to five, etc. So you can see that the number of interconnections grows much faster than the number of nodes, and it creates a huge amount more complexity. Anyway, so I'm actually talking about a very specific thing, which is the interconnectedness number of the schedule. And here's the thing in physics is that when for a given system, when the complexity or the interconnectedness number gets to a certain level, the system starts behaving differently than when it was smaller. You get what's known as emergent effects. So an extreme kind of example is intelligence. So it's just neurons that are connected and sharing pathways, and at some point you've got personality and things coming out. But a much more fundamental one is in physics is what's known as entropic forces. So, for example, how springs work. Like why when you stretch a spring, it actually snaps back on itself. That is actually a result. It's so an entropic force is something that's not a fundamental force of nature. It's something that arises from the interconnectedness of things based on a fundamental force.
Okay, well, putting physics and go Slinky go aside.
Yeah.
Shout out to anyone who's an Ace Ventura fan. There's probably not many. When we're talking about complexity in projects and we're starting to look at the interconnectedness of them and we're looking at acceleration, I guess what you just said to me was just go delete more relationship ties. Go into P6 and just start hacking away. Does that actually solve the problem of complexity, or do you need to do something that is actually more fundamentally changing to the project?
So it depends. So here we're making the example. We're making the assumption that the data is a very close reflection of reality. So you could just go in there and delete all the plans, but that wouldn't. If that's not reflective of what's actually happening, you're not deleting complexity. You're simplifying data to the point where it doesn't reflect the underlying nature of the environment you're trying to model. Well, first of all, I'll talk about mathematically what does complexity do in projects. Well, it only works on acceleration types that take into account variability. So if you're doing, for example, critical path method or single critical path method, or you're tracking progress by things like S curve, it would have no impact on that type of acceleration. But if you're looking at, for example, stochastic acceleration like p positions, so you've run a Monte Carlo simulation and you're looking at p positions, what increased complexity does is it pushes the entire curve out later and it makes long tails longer. So it makes everything a little bit slower and a little bit worse. So to your point, yes, what we're looking to do if you want to accelerate a project by decomplexifying it, which is why I started calling it that name, is you want to correctly start slashing out interconnectedness. Now, how you do that, I don't know. It depends on the project, doesn't it? Like how do you just stop two things being related to each other?
After half a cup of coffee, I think the word you're looking for is simplifying.
Yeah.
But you know what? That might not sell the books, folks. You let us know. You let us know what word you prefer. I think when you go back to, I want to quickly go back to when you're talking about P positions in Monte Carlo, because that can, for some people listening, we jumped into a realm where that may not have resonated, and you can play it back to me and let me know if I'm talking about this right. But I'm running a risk analysis and I'm using different duration uncertainties, let's call it that, right?
Yeah.
Just kind of simplify it down, right? And maybe on a regular project, I'm looking at like a 90, 110, 120 type distribution, right? So, 90, on the lower side, we're beating our durations by 10%. Most likely we're about 10% over. And in the worst cases, we're kind of 20, 30% over, right? Now, when you start talking about complexity, let's say we go look at our project and those relationship ties and how the project's laid out is signifying that this is a more complex project than previously. What you're saying is hypothetically, I should actually be bumping up those duration uncertainties, at least on the likely to worst case scenario side, because that's actually what's going to increase my tail end.
Not quite. Very close, but not quite. So complexity works on the network, not on the node. So, for example, if I had two projects, both of them had the same number of tasks and the same uncertainty, but one was more complex or more interconnected than the other. If you run a Monte Carlo simulation, the one that's more complex would be worse in the results. So what it is the more interconnected you are, coming back to my example of 3 people and then 5 people, the more interconnected you are, the more states the system can find itself in, and the more of those states are you're fucked up. So it's in physics, this is actually one of the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. I think it's the third law. I can't remember off my memory, but it's the everything tends toward disorder, or more specifically, entropy increases over time. It's the concept of entropy, which is, for anyone who's super interested, really key for like black holes and things like this. But it's that trend. So it's the same in projects, actually, when you look at the underlying. And actually, there's a number of data scientists that have recently released papers on this. I work with a couple. One is a guy called Alexei and another's Christos. But essentially, they show that project schedules are entropic. They actually do tend towards disorder. And the more interconnected they are, the more they tend towards disorder. And disorder in schedule land is late. So it literally is just projects that have just one-to-one-to-one relationships are more predictable and less delayed than projects that have branches. Fact.
That should give people food to chew on how to build schedules and think about how to execute projects, because I go back to the tried and true kind of schedule levels type diagram. where you have at the top, you have milestones, and then you have level 2 schedule, kind of some bars, and level 3, some more detail after that. And level 4, like a full blown out detail schedule. And level 5 is, I think you get down to like almost hourly. But I think in each of those levels, you can take a perspective of this is going to be more complex, and how can we simplify the execution of this?
Mm-hmm.
How can we simplify, the, how this goes together? And really this starts to play into like the commissioning side, wherever all rivers meet. At a certain point in time, you need power, water, any other utilities that you might need to have will all connect at the end at commissioning. And so, yeah, I think it gives people quite a lot to think about on the complexity side.
You actually said something there that I think I might steal for the book, because obviously I'm approaching this from a first principles of physics perspective, but the takeaway is actually the subtleties to it. The takeaway is what you said, which is one of the methods of acceleration is simplifying, because complexity, which is the opposite of simplicity, mathematically slows down projects. So, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. It's
Mm-hmm.
if you have less stuff that can go wrong, you should finish earlier than if you have more stuff that could go wrong.
Yeah.
Like, it's people know this. It's the same in sports where you're like, just get the basics right. Don't try and excel at the complex skills. Just get the basics really, really right and do them repeatable all the time. It's that kind of principle.
Yeah.
What this does, which is where the research is going now, which is a bit further, is if you are in a situation where you have to have complexity, because you and I work on projects where they just have to have some form of complexity,
Oh, yeah.
then it's actually how you manage that complexity therefore changes. So there's something called the G number, which isn't named after me, by the way. It was actually coined by someone else, but it's the G number, which is the measure, and it's the tipping point where directive management, so identification of a critical path and management of a critical path, is optimum, versus incentive management, where you don't know where the critical path is going to be, so you just
Yeah.
incentivize everyone to be more predictable, so you reduce the uncertainty. And the G number is the mathematical tipping point where incentivization becomes more valuable than directive.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Lots of food for thought there. Any other acceleration? We've talked a lot about different techniques, different possibilities. What else is physics hiding that the PMI manual isn't providing us?
Um, there's a lot. There's a lot. But I another one which is related to, I might call it simplification rather than decomplexifying, but the physics, like the mathematics, is the
I'm
mathematics of
glad we're
complexity. So I
hashing
don't
this
know.
out. I'm glad we're hashing this out, like out for people to see like how people come up with names of things, so everyone can like see, how Greg minds work, where he's like the decomplexifying of the neuron pathic trophic blah blah blah.
I like decomplexifying because it's an ironic title.
Yeah,
It's a complex
it
title.
is. It is. Yeah. There may be a
The
simpler word for that.
but, but why not be a hypocrite in your own book?
We all got to live our best lives, folks.
The other one which I found really, really interesting was another technique called impact avoidance. So there's a whole host of techniques around uncertainty. One is long tail slicing, where you take the long tail distribution of uncertainty measures and you try and essentially cut off the events that could lead to a long tail, because long tails are what blow out p positions
Yeah.
and things like this.
Well, let me just, for people in the crowd who like you're not a risk, you haven't dove into risk, and you haven't really grabbed a huge understanding of it. And Greg, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially, just imagine kind of like a sloped hill. And on each side of the slope hill are probabilities where your project could potentially finish, and in the middle of the slope hill is where most likely that's where it's going to finish. But then as you go out and it slopes down, on one side of the graph, one side it's how early it could potentially finish, and on the other side is how late it could potentially finish. Now, in large scale capital construction that is of high magnitude and fairly complex, they typically don't finish early. So we don't talk a lot about that side of the graph. However, that could be a good book idea. On the other side of the graph is how late it could be. And this is where you've done your risk analysis, you've looked at how project performance is going, and you're looking at, wow, this project could be a year late, a year and a half late, 2 years late, 3 years late, and that's that tail as it continues to go out, how actually late your project could be. So that's when Greg's talking about that long tail, that's what he's talking about. The probability that your project is either going to finish on time or blow out.
That's pretty spot on. And that effect happens not just at a project level, but also at a task level. So if you actually measure across millions of tasks their performance against forecast, which obviously I run a data science company that does this kind of stuff, so I get to see that kind of thing. It does that exact graph. So like when people do a plus or minus 10%, so rather than saying, oh, I think this task will take 10 days, but it could take 9, it could take 11, that's oversimplifying the world. There's a very small chance that it could also take 100 days. And it's that very small chance of that long tail that is a really, really big mathematical problem for these projects. Anyway, so that's one of the techniques where you're trying to kind of cut off all of that long tail. But impact avoidance is a technique where you just don't even bother to engage with the problem in the first place. It's I'm just not accepting that scope of work. I physically just will not do that bit of the project or won't do that project. Now, a lot of people, I was trained in this regard actually, where it's, if you it's actually more about what you refuse to do rather than what you actually accept to do that generates the vast majority of your profits. But when I was going very deep into and comparing it against some of the models in physics and economics, because this is really the science of stochastic analysis, it's probability analysis, and in economics it's things like risk around stocks and volatility of options and how you price options. So, for example, one of the models is called the Black-Scholes model, which got the Nobel Prize, which was the first model to actually price options on stocks. Anyway, when you go deep into that, there actually is a core concept that I've never heard in project management before, but it seems so fundamental, which is people think that impact avoidance is about being extremely risk adverse. And actually, it's not. Impact avoidance, so just refusing to deal with things that generate long tails, is actually about avoiding meaningful speculation about the future consistently over a long period of time. And if you think about that, it changes an unbounded problem, which is, will this stock go up or down over time? That's speculation, into a very bounded problem, which is, I refuse to deal with speculation. A perfect example of this in stock trading is buying calls and puts around a stock. So when I was doing my MBA and learning trading analysis, essentially a put and a call is, if the price goes too low on a stock, I've got an insurance policy that backs me off. So if the price goes too low, it doesn't matter. Someone will pay me a certain price. And the other end is, if I'm selling stock and the price goes up too high, I've got an opportunity cost that I've sold it too cheap, and someone will pay me a high price. So I'm actually not speculating about the future at all, because I've bounded both my up and downside. Anyway, when we're talking about projects, and if you think about this, I've never really come across a person whose role it is to analyze what speculation has gone into a bid and just refuse to put that forward. There's people who do it, and those people are like very valuable project managers, commercial managers, procurement managers, etc. But it's actually about a frame of thinking, and I've never seen this taught. Like, most people bidding are very optimistic. Now,
Yeah.
optimism and speculation avoidance are not the opposite. Speculation avoidance is not pessimism. Speculation avoidance is actually just going into the logic and going, you have no clue what you're talking about.
We got to slam this home into the project because part of me feels that this is already happening and it doesn't create any positive outcomes on one side of it. It seems to me like you're like, well, we're in a cold zone. I mean, we can't dig in the ground 3 months of the year. So like,
That's speculation. That's
if it
speculation, though.
gets, if it gets cold, is it speculation? I mean,
It is speculation unless you've
unless
come
you
to me
have
and
what the
said,
weather.
I've tested it and we physically can't. At which point, that isn't speculation. That's extrapolation based on evidence. So it's little things like that.
So if I created, a list of 30, 40 risks on a project, you could go down that list as a first pass and say speculation, evidence based. That weather one.
Yeah.
Hey, Greg, man, here's the tables. Like, dude, ground's frozen. And you'd be like, okay, check. But then if I came and said another one like labor, is constrained. Well, how constrained
I'll
is
give you
it?
a perfect example, actually, because this way it goes. Weather is always speculation because you cannot categorically say what the weather will do. However, if you came to me with a weather evidence of historic weather and an insurance policy, that's now no longer speculation. That's 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 bounded limits. So if you said if weather gets worse than this, insurance policy always pays us, and if weather is better than this, we can dig. It's fine. There's no speculation in the future. I'm not speculating on weather then. I know no matter what the scenario, I get paid.
Yeah, this is almost like like you've pre-mitigated, like this is bounded's right. I'm just trying to throw terms out there that maybe more smooth brain folks like myself can understand. This is almost to me where because a lot of times it happens after the fact. You have risks that need to get mitigated. And then it's like, well, we'll figure out that mitigation later. Or these are the steps you would take to mitigate it, but it's not actually mitigated. Like I provide you the weather table in your example, that actually doesn't, count because we don't know if it's going to hold or not. We have nothing that actually benefits us there. I just know the ground is frozen these 2 months typically, and we can't do anything during these 2 months typically. I still haven't, closed the door on this one. I haven't created something that's an actual benefit later on. And then I make a gamble on saying, yeah, I think we're going to be good in month 3, not the two previous months. And if I did do that, I would think in my brain that I mitigated it, but I actually didn't.
This is exactly it. And I use an example. I don't know if this obviously will go in the book, but I use an example actually of investing. And I say, okay, imagine I give you $20,000 today, and in 50 years, you have to give me $20,000 back. People may think that just sitting on the cash is the safest way, but actually, you are passively speculating on interest rates because the purchase power of the money in 50 years will not. So you're not actually giving me $20,000 in 50 years. You're giving me something like $1,000 of purchasing power. So it's these little, as opposed to, so it's actually worse to accidentally speculate about the future than it is to actively speculate about the future, because at least you know that you're speculating. But this is the key thing that you and I've talked about this about risk management. A lot of risk management in projects is about just going through process, as opposed to deeply understanding how to have a bigger upside than your downside. The big private equity and venture capital people that I've met in the world, they don't speculate. It's like there is zero way they lose. And it would be a lot longer episode about how they go about that, but there is no way a private equity person who is competent doesn't end up a multimillionaire because of how they work the money. Either they take millions from the funds that people have given them to invest, and that's how they do it, Or the other way is they actually grow that money into a massive amount of money and they take some of that too.
Yeah,
It's that kind
I
of
don't
model.
see that. I don't see that strategic thought process that happens, early on in projects, very early on, before you get planners and schedulers involved. That is where I feel like it, from the owner's perspective, there is a lot more extremely strategic positioning that could go on than what is typically done. Most often people have a
I'd
business
agree.
need date that they need to hit. So, I need this whatever data center in 18 months to serve up, TikTok cat videos to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, cool. We'll go hit that data center. And then they roll forward with the assumption that that is the date they have to hit. So in the first picking of the date based off a business need, you've already gone off of this trajectory. You have zero impact avoidance built into your first date pick, because you have to hit that date. So you've already bounded yourself to a physical date you have to hit in the future, which you have no idea whether you could hit or not. And then
Mhm.
all of the pieces after that get put in place, eventually you get to some point where the deck has been set, the game has been picked, and you are forced into that box that you have to live in. So this is interesting because I feel like there's probably a lot more interesting options on the forefront of projects that people don't even seem to consider to go execute on.
You're right. There's two things here. The first is that this is really long term thinking. So when I was thinking through all of the different, how would you manipulate curves in physics, and then practically what does it actually mean, like simplifying or decomplexifying and impact avoidance and long tail slicing and all of these things. This is a strategy where you will never win the lottery. You'll never turn $1 into 100 million, but you'll also never lose the lottery, and you will still be playing. It's the one. It's the to be honest, it's the Warren Buffett kind of approach of, in my example, why did I pick $20,000? Because $20,000 over the last 50 years would have given you over $1 million in your account today. And $1 million at 50 years old is enough for most people to retire 15 years early. So
But it doesn't buy you the Lambo, bro.
it doesn't buy you the Lambo, but personally, that's the gift that I want to give to my daughter. I want to guarantee
A
that
Lambo
she.
or the million
No,
dollars?
no, I'm not going to give her the Lambo. As
Oh,
in,
hot pink
I've done the thing.
Lambo.
Like, it's a bit more, but I'm one of the gifts that I'm giving. Me and my wife are giving to our daughter is, it's in some of it's in guaranteed investments account like bonds, some not. But all things being equal, she will be able to retire at age 50, no matter what. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know anyone in my generation that isn't sitting on big, big parents' wealth who can do that, or who hasn't worked their absolute ass off and earned millions a year. I'm like, okay, well, that's why I think. But it's the same in construction. Like in the UK last week, ISG went bankrupt. A couple of years ago, Carillion went bankrupt,
Yeah.
and that's basically this principle not being applied. So, if you're thinking, would a company get really, really big over 50 years, really thinking like this? Yeah. Yeah. Because actually, one of the key lessons from private equity and venture capitalism people is the thing that makes you really, really big over time is not dying. That's
Yeah.
it. Like, you just have to get 5% bigger every year, 10% bigger every year, and just live. It's the
Compounding
people who
returns.
go 300% bigger, and then the next year they burn through all their cash and die.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. This is loads of food for thought, an information dense episode. One last thing, if you want to put on your tinfoil hat and go down a deep rabbit hole when you talked about ISG going out of business, the vast majority of graphs and studies and percentages you see on construction productivity tie towards GC profitability, not in-field people working. Feel free. I got an article. Go down that rabbit hole. Go down that rabbit hole.
Wait, Micah, are you telling me that businesses that have been created to make profit will optimize profit as opposed to optimizing other things.
No, I mean, maybe. But what I'm saying is those famous graphs that say this is construction productivity versus manufacturing, they measure the profitability of the general contracting companies as the measure of productivity. They are not measuring people swinging hammers and using drills out into the field. And so everyone bangs on about how construction productivity has never increased. It's down. It should keep up with manufacturing. We need all of this innovation, which I'm not hampering innovation. I'm just saying when I've done the research and looked at the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, who put out most of those famous graphs, they don't involve people actually creating widgets. They involve the profitability of these companies. So it's, yeah.
But construction plays a very, very, that is super interesting. Okay, that's another episode, because construction plays a very, very clever game about profitability. It's not about profitability, and actually quite often they don't want crazy profitability.
Yeah, no. And so anyway, folks, we're out of time this week. If you like this deep dive, feel free to leave us a comment. Let us know. We're happy to go even deeper. This was such a fun episode. We are patiently waiting the next book from the Beyond Deadline series about project acceleration. It's going to be a good one. We're going to talk more about it. For everyone this week, though, have a great one, and we're going to see you on the next one. Sailing the ship USS Complexity, Captain's Mark, 4317. I need impact avoidance.